If you feel like you keep practicing and you're not getting better,
Wow. Okay.
there are a couple of explanations. And there's a couple of questions you can ask yourself. And there are a few things to do to improve the situation. So that's what this video is about. The first explanation is simple. You are actually getting better, but it just doesn't feel like it. When we think about learning or change, a lot of times our default is thinking in terms of linear change. So if I practice for 10 hours, that should equal 10 times the amount of improvement that I get from just practicing 1 hour. But it actually doesn't work like that. The typical learning curve is a little bit more like this. When you first start out learning how to do something, then you can pretty rapidly get better. But as you improve over time, then the same amount of practice or the same amount of study time is not going to yield the same amount of gains just because you're already so much better. But even this is an oversimplification. Whenever you're learning something new, you're going to go through what are called performance plateaus. So that's where your performance is not improving even though you're putting in more practice time or more work into improving. And the reason for that is that a lot of times your brain has to reorganize how it thinks about something, or has to get used to new elements that you're introducing. For instance, let's say you're a teacher and you have a new curriculum or you have a new technology. Well, that new curriculum or new technology might make it more difficult for you to teach in the short term, but ultimately prove more effective in the long term. In other words, sometimes you have to get worse to get better, and you want to keep practicing so that you get better in the long term. There's actually another part to this explanation. It can be very hard to measure your skill accurately. It depends on what area you're in. So some areas are easier to measure than others. If you're a chess player, your ELO rating, which is the rating that you get after playing competitive games, is a pretty accurate rating of how good you are at chess. You either win games against stronger players or you don't. And if you're winning those games against stronger players, that means you're stronger too. But in other cases, it's a little trickier. How do you know you're a good teacher? The thing that you care about is long-term learning and improvements in the student. What you're measuring is usually short-term. So tests are a short-term measure. They might not be measuring all the things that you care about. So the thing you're measuring is not only always the main skill that you're interested in optimizing for. Ask yourself two questions. One, how well am I measuring the skill I'm trying to get better at? And two, am I in one of those performance plateau periods? The second explanation is that you're not practicing correctly. This is where the idea of deliberate practice comes in. So the first thing you need to do is you need to identify the expert skills. You have to know what it is that experts do in whatever field you're in and what makes them so good. Without this, there's no way of really targeting what you're trying to get good at. And people have misconceptions about what it takes to get good at something or why experts are good at what they do all the time. For instance, if you think that cooking is about following and learning recipes, then you're kind of headed in the wrong direction because it's a lot more about patterns and understanding the processes that lead to better and worse food. So identifying the expert practice keeps us grounded, knowing that we are headed towards some point of expertise. So you have to be a little careful here because if you isolate too much, you end up missing the forest for the trees. You want to find ways of practicing like an expert practices without necessarily doing it at the level that they're doing it at.
Oh, that was bad.
The second part here is that you need to practice. Part of the whole point of the research on deliberate practice is that it's more about the quality of practice than the quantity of practice. That means that you can't just do the same old thing every single time. You have to be focusing on what's challenging for you. So if I play the entertainer every day for months on end, like I did as a kid, that is not going to make me a better piano player. I'm just kind of playing the same piece over and over again. Not to mention it's relatively boring for me, although I do like The Entertainer. It is a fantastic piece of music. Generally speaking, this means focusing on the things that are hard for you, not the things that are easy for you. The third part of deliberate practice is self-evaluation. Now, a lot of times people kind of skip this part, but it's one thing that experts share in almost any domain is the ability to evaluate themselves and improve their performance. So when you do self-evaluation, when you say, okay, I'm looking at what I did, I'm looking at how well I cooked this souffle, which was not well at all. When you evaluate yourself, you're kind of giving yourself both the opportunity to practice self-evaluation in this domain, whatever that domain is. It's also an opportunity to understand deeply the nature of the domain itself, because you learn a lot from looking back at what you did and trying to figure out, well, what did I do right? And more importantly, what did I do wrong? And how can I improve next time? Now, the part 4 here is that you need feedback. And this is kind of the critical piece. If you're not getting feedback from somewhere about how well you're doing, then it's really, really hard to improve, because you are just sitting there and you're trying to figure out, well, what am I doing wrong? How can I improve, et cetera, et cetera. But someone who is looking at it from the outside and who is already an expert in that domain, they have a much better sense of like, oh, the thing that you're missing is whatever it is the expert can tell you. Then that's really a critical part of this. And ideally, we would all have our coaches by the side of us all the time, no matter what we're doing, but that's not always going to be the case. So you need to find ways of getting feedback, even in the absence of an NBA basketball player or something coming in to tell you how you're doing, because they're not going to spend the time to do that with you. It depends on the domain how this feedback comes about. So for instance, in programming, if you're learning to program, you get some basic feedback just from, seeing how your programs run and what the mistakes are and trying to figure out the mistakes on your own. But then you can go to a place like Stack Overflow or something like this and get feedback from other people, hopefully more expert than yourself. The fifth step here is that you've really got to repeat your practice over time. The first 4 steps, that's like one cycle. And then the 5th step here is meaning you have to do this cycle of challenging practice, self-evaluation, feedback, challenging practice, self-evaluation, feedback over and over and over again to really accelerate your skills forward. Sometimes people underestimate how long it takes to learn things. It actually takes a long time and it takes a lot of effort. And deliberate practice is actually something that should be, in principle, tiring. Like you should feel like, wow, I really tried, I really exerted myself. Either I'm mentally tired or I'm physically tired, or both. There's always a lot more to be said about everything. But that's it. Now go practice.
There we go. No, that was just. Whoa! There we go.